This is question number 30 of our calculus review. The differentiable functions f and g are defined for all real numbers x. Values of f, f prime, g, and g prime for various values of x are given in this table. X being 1, f of x is 3, f prime of x is 4, g of x is 2, g prime of x is 6. For x is 2, f of x is 1, f prime of x is 5, g of x is 8, and g prime of x is 7. And finally, for an x value of 3, f of x is 7, f prime of x is 7, g of x is 2, and g prime of x is 9. We want if h of x is equal to f of g of x, we want to find h prime of 3. So, doing that one, that means that h prime of 3 is going to be equal to f prime of g of 3 times g prime of 3. So f prime of 2, because g of 3 is indeed 2, times g prime of 3. F prime of 2 is 5. G prime of 3 is 9. This makes 45. For capital H of x is equal to g of f of x. We want capital H prime of 2. So capital H prime of 2 is g prime of f of 2 times f prime of 2. So this would be simply g prime of f of 2 is 1 times f prime of 2. So g of 1 is going, g prime of 1 is 6 times f prime of 2 is 5. 6 times 5, this is going to give us 30. Thank you.